In October 1415, an exhausted, underfed English army ravaged by dysentery had its route back to the port of Calais blocked by a French force many times its size on a muddy field near the village of Agincourt. Audiences usually assume the victory came from the genius of King Henry V or the courage of the English archers, but if we break down every number, tons of arrows, barrels of bowstrings, supply convoys, days of marching, we see this battle was decided months in advance in the woodworking shops, harbors, and logistics ledgers of both kingdoms. The familiar image painted by films is a young king standing before his troops, delivering the St. Crispin's Day speech, and the impoverished archers suddenly transformed into heroes through faith. That story is a fine one, but it overlooks an uncomfortable truth. On that morning, most of the English soldiers were not thinking about glory. They were thinking about their empty stomachs, about the intestinal disease that had tormented them for 2 weeks, and about the distance remaining in their flight to Calais. This was not an army seeking battle. This was an army in retreat, backed into a corner. And yet it was this very army that crushed a force considered the flower of European knighthood. To understand this paradox, we must go back 2 months earlier, to the mouth of the river Seine. In August 1415, Henry V landed with an estimated 12,000 troops and began the siege of the port of Harfleur. The plan called for a few days. In reality, it dragged on for more than 5 weeks, and the most fearsome enemy at Harfleur was not the French defenders, but foul water, spoiled food, and dysentery. Modern estimates suggest the English army lost roughly a third of its strength to disease and repatriation before firing a single arrow at Agincourt. In other words, the 1415 campaign nearly failed because of logistics before it could succeed because of anything else. And the central question of this entire video lies right there. How did an army so utterly depleted, marching hundreds of kilometers through enemy territory, still have on the decisive day enough arrows to shoot, enough dry bowstrings to draw, enough organization to stand firm in ranks, while its opponent, many times larger and fighting on home ground, operated so chaotically that it trampled itself? The answer lies not on the battlefield but in the supply chain, and to understand the supply chain of 1415, one must first understand how tool-poor that world was. Without refrigeration, meat and fish could only be preserved by salting or drying, and 1 barrel of salted meat going bad on the road meant dozens of soldiers going hungry or doubled over with dysentery. Without the telegraph, every order and every piece of news traveled at exactly the speed of a horse, estimated at only about 50 to 60 kilometers a day in good conditions, meaning that by the time a king made a decision, the battlefield may have changed days earlier. And the greatest burden was the stomach. An army of around 10,000 men and thousands of horses, by modern estimates, devoured many tons of food and hay each day. Converted into practical terms, merely feeding that army far from its supply sources would require hundreds of horse-drawn wagon trips rolling continuously over dirt roads that a single rainstorm could turn into pools of mud. Placed on the scales, every number on paper tilted decisively toward France. A population estimated at 4 to 5 times that of England, a more abundant treasury, and most importantly, they were fighting on home ground, with villages, granaries, and forges right behind them, while every sack of Henry V flour had to cross the English Channel and then trudge along with the army through enemy territory. This is the first shocking contrast of the story. The side holding every theoretical logistical advantage was the side that let its system collapse in the mud, while the side that should have starved to death on the road was the side that had exactly what it needed, in the right place at the right time. Why? Here is the reveal, right from the start. The answer lies in 4 pillars that the rest of this video will peel back one by one. First, an arrow supply chain industrialized before the very concept of industry existed. Second, the enormous fleet that carried the entire army with its horses and provisions across the sea. Third, the roughly 400-kilometer march that was in essence a race between the soldiers' legs and their empty stomachs. And fourth, the muddy choke point at Agincourt, where France's overwhelming numbers themselves became a self-strangling burden. And to work through those 4 pillars, we must begin with the question that seems smallest but decides everything. The hundreds of thousands of arrows that rained down on the French cavalry that day, where in the end did they come from? The answer lies not on the battlefield, but in the decades before, in workshops scattered across England, because the longbow was not merely a weapon, it was the final output of an entire national industrial chain operating before the concept of industry was born. Let's do some simple math. A skilled English archer could shoot an estimated 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Multiply that by the 5,000 to 6,000 archers present at Agincourt, and you get roughly 50 to 70,000 arrows launched skyward in a single minute of combat. 1 minute. That means after just a few sustained volleys, Henry V's army had consumed an amount of ammunition that no workshop could possibly produce mid-campaign. All of it had to be made in advance, gathered in advance, and shipped in advance before the first vessel left port, and the English crown understood this better than anyone. Decrees from the early 15th century show the monarchy once requisitioned hundreds of thousands of arrows for a single campaign. To put that in perspective, that is an estimated many dozens of tons of ashwood, forged iron heads, and goose feathers, the equivalent of dozens of wagons just to carry arrows, not counting the thousands of spare bowstrings made of hemp fiber that had to be kept absolutely dry, because a damp string meant a silenced cannon. But here is the most valuable reveal. This supply chain did not begin in the woodshop, it began in the law. Since the reign of Edward III, English law compelled commoners to practice archery on Sundays, and at times even banned other games so the people would not be distracted from shooting practice. And there is more. The Crown once ordered the collection of goose feathers on a nationwide scale. Every goose in the English countryside was, quite literally, a link in the war machine, because arrow fletching required proper feathers to fly true. In other words, England's real arsenal was not a warehouse of arrows but its very population, a reservoir of archer manpower nurtured, trained, and maintained by the state across generations. That is the kind of asset no gold or silver can buy and no rival can copy. Within a single campaign season. To have 6,000 archers at Agincourt in 1415, England had to begin on the village practice grounds of half a century earlier. And to run that enormous machine, England did not rely on a genius general, but on a title that sounds very administrative: Master of the King's Ordnance, the official in charge of the King's munitions. In the 1415 campaign, the man holding this seat was Nicholas Merbury, a name nearly unknown in popular history yet a vital link in the entire expedition. Merbury was responsible for gathering cannon, gunpowder, arrows, siege equipment, and countless other technical supplies, coordinating orders from blacksmiths, arrow makers, and bowyers across the kingdom to the assembly points. The existence of such a dedicated office speaks to something essential. For England, war had been bureaucratized with ledgers, requisitioned contracts, and inventory procedures, rather than being left to the enthusiasm of the nobility. And it is precisely here that the comparison with France becomes shocking. France did not lack warriors. It had the largest and most prestigious knightly class in Europe, but training a heavily armored knight was a problem of an entire fortune and an entire lifetime. A warhorse worth many years of income, armor custom fitted to measurements, plus decades of training from adolescence. Each knight, economically speaking, was an expensive, one-of-a-kind handcrafted product that could not be quickly replaced. Meanwhile, England fostered firepower from peasants, with bowsmen trained free of charge by law from childhood, equipped with a bow costing, by estimates, dozens of times less than a knight's armor. The result was a merciless asymmetry. English firepower was cheaper, more numerous, and faster to replenish, while every French loss was a lifetime's investment evaporating in minutes. France had an army of brilliant individuals. England had an intellectual ecosystem that knew how to shoot arrows. But let's not conclude too quickly, because producing that mountain of weapons was only half the problem. The other half was far harder. How to move the entire army, dozens of tons of arrows, war horses, and its provisions across the English Channel and onto French soil? Henry V's answer to that crossing problem was a colossal maritime mobilization campaign. In the summer of 1415, the English crown requisitioned and hired an estimated 700 to 1,100 vessels of every kind: merchant ships, fishing boats, wine transports gathered at the port of Southampton to carry roughly 11,000 to 12,000 troops and thousands of horses to the Normandy coast in August, one of the largest amphibious landings medieval England ever undertook. Picture the scale. Each warhorse needed its own loading ramp, makeshift stalls built in the hold, hay and fresh water for the voyage, meaning the horses alone consumed a significant portion of the entire fleet's carrying capacity, not to mention dozens of tons of arrows, siege equipment, and food reserves. But the most interesting reveal lies not in the ships, but in the paperwork. This army was not called up by old-style feudal command, but recruited through indentures, written contracts specifying how many men each lord must bring, how long they would serve, and at what pay, typically around 6 pence per day for an archer by estimates, double for a man-at-arms. In other words, Agincourt essentially began as a financial project with ledgers, terms, and payment obligations, and like every large project, it was short of money from the start. To cover the first round of wages, Henry V had to pawn the crown, the royal jewels, and precious liturgical objects to creditors, breaking up individual pieces of jewelry into collateral distributed to his commanders as a form of wage guarantee. The king, celebrated by posterity as a military genius, had, before a single arrow was fired, to do the work of a chief financial officer taking out loans. Yet when the fleet made landfall and that contractual machine began operating on French soil, the plan immediately collided with a variable no indenture had anticipated: the town of Harfleur. A siege expected to take only a few weeks stretched past 5 weeks, and the most fearsome enemy was not the defenders but the contaminated water around the camp. An epidemic of dysentery swept through the English encampment, claiming by estimates several thousand men, some dying on the spot, others so weakened they had to board ships home. When Harfleur finally opened its gates, the mighty army that had left Southampton numbered only about 6,000 to 9,000 men depending on the source, the overwhelming majority of them archers, and the campaign season was draining away with each day of late autumn. Facing this situation, Henry V made a decision that looks reckless at first glance, but was in fact a cold logistical calculation. March on foot roughly 400 kilometers from Harfleur to Calais, the nearest English stronghold where ships and food stores waited. The math was laid out plainly: 8 days on the road, each man carrying rations for exactly about 8 days. No heavy baggage train, no sieges, no engagements, just move fast. Meaning the entire campaign was now measured in a single unit, the stomach. And the second variable appeared immediately. Every ford on the River Somme had been staked and held by French troops, forcing the English army to swing deep inland upstream in search of a crossing, turning an 8-day journey into roughly 2.5 weeks of trudging. The conversion here is brutally simple. Every extra day of marching was a day of negative rations, and according to contemporary accounts, in the final days English soldiers had to gather chestnuts and wild berries in place of bread, drinking from dirty streams the very water that had sown dysentery at Harfleur under pouring autumn rain, their armor and bowstrings soaked through. Meanwhile, across the river a cruel irony was unfolding. The French army marched in parallel on home soil, backed by inland granaries and friendly towns, always well fed, but here is a reveal few notice: that very abundance worked against them, because with no stomachs driving them, the French commanders dawdled, stopping to gather more troops, waiting for more lords to arrive, letting their formation swell into a mass of tens of thousands that was difficult to coordinate, with multiple overlapping layers of command. The English, paradoxically, grew more disciplined the hungrier they became. March fast, formation closed tight, no one allowed to break off and plunder because breaking off meant death, no one allowed to fall behind because falling behind meant being abandoned. Hunger, the thing that should have dissolved an army, instead became the organizational glue binding 6,000 men into a single mass with only one goal: survive to reach Calais. Those two opposing logistical systems, one well-fed but ragged in coordination, one utterly depleted but tight, as a machine moved in parallel through each day of rain, until the road to Calais was blocked by a wall of men across a freshly plowed, waterlogged field near a small village named Agincourt, where the two equations were finally forced to produce their answer. And that answer was determined first of all by the shape of the field itself. Look at the map. The Agincourt battlefield was a narrow strip of land, estimated at only about 700 to 900 meters wide, pinched tightly between the woods of Agincourt and Tramcourt like a natural funnel. In other words, this was not a battlefield, this was a logistical choke point in the most literal sense. A corridor where everything passing through had to queue, and the ground of that corridor was even worse. Fields freshly plowed, saturated after days of continuous October rain, turned into a layer of thick, sticky clay mud that could swallow a man's legs to the ankle, even the knee. Now let's do the math the French commanders did not do. Modern sources estimate the French had from 12 to 30,000 men. Medieval chronicles inflated the number far higher, and that entire mass of humanity had to funnel into a front less than 1 kilometer wide. Picture it this way. It is cramming an entire stadium full of people, each wearing 25 to 30 kilograms of steel armor, into a narrow street, then ordering them all to advance together through a bog. The more men, the worse the jam. Numerical superiority, the thing that should have been France's greatest weapon, instantly flipped its sign into a deadly burden. The rear ranks could see nothing and only knew to push forward. The front ranks were squeezed from behind, with no room to swing a weapon, no room to retreat, not even room to fall properly. One man slipping in the mud dragged down 2 or 3 others, and with 30 kilograms of armor on his back, getting up amid the crushing crowd was nearly impossible. Every step forward the French infantry mass took across those 300 meters of mire drained as much strength as a long march, so that when they finally reached the English line, what awaited them was not open ground to deploy, but an engineering wall almost unbelievably cheap. Wooden stakes sharpened at both ends, driven at an angle into the ground directly in front of each archer's position. It was that crude row of stakes, not any miracle, that broke France's trump card from the very first move. The charge of the armored cavalry, the most expensive war machines of the age, ground to a halt before a fortification costing next to nothing. And here is where a detail often overlooked deserves a reveal. That row of stakes was no improvised inspiration on the eve of battle, but an order Henry V had issued days earlier after scouts reported the French plan to use cavalry to sweep away the archers, meaning every English soldier had carried a piece of the defensive line on his shoulder throughout the retreat, and the entire wall of fortifications was transported to the battlefield on the very shoulders of a starving, freezing army. The irony is that the other side lacked no brains. Marshal Jean de la Mengre, known to the world as Boucicaut, was one of France's most professional commanders, a veteran of campaigns from Prussia to Nicopolis, and co-author of a rather well-crafted pre-drafted battle plan with cavalry wings, striking the flanks aimed directly at the archers, with echelons clearly divided. But that plan collapsed not on paper but in execution. Too many great nobles demanded the honor of the front rank, command authority overlapped among dukes and marshals, and the crucial cavalry wing could not muster its designed strength at the hour of the charge, because many knights had scattered to find warm shelter in the rainy night. Boucicaut's individual talent was swallowed by his own side's chaotic command system. He ended the battle as a prisoner and died on English soil 6 years later. The end-of-day result is one of the most shocking contrasts in medieval military history. The French lost an estimated 6,000 to 10,000 men, including a string of dukes, counts, and even the marshal captured alive, while the English, according to most modern sources, lost only a few hundred, a gap of dozens of times. Not because each English soldier was 10 times better than his opponent, but because France's colossal machine had strangled itself. The mud slowed it, the density jammed it, the chaotic command blinded it. The French had lost before the first arrow found its mark. And when we lay all the pieces side by side, the arrows leaving workshops in London, the ships requisitioned at Southampton, the rations dwindling along the retreat, and the narrow mud flat between two woods, we begin to touch the central paradox that makes Agincourt a lesson reaching far beyond 1415. That paradox sits right on the surface of the numbers, which hardly anyone is willing to face directly. France in 1415 had many times England's population, was wealthier, had more seasoned knights, fought on home ground with granaries and fortresses right behind it, and lost catastrophically. While the English army, starving, dysentery, ridden, roughly 400 kilometers of marching from its home port, won overwhelmingly. The difference lay not in courage, for the French knights that day still advanced through mud under a rain of arrows, but in this. The English operated a single school system prime commander, one indenture payroll binding every man by contract, one supply chain running from the arrow workshops of London to the mud flats of Picardy, while the French operated as a coalition of brilliant individuals whom no one truly coordinated. Reviewing the 4 links we have traced, each was prepared before the battle not by hours but by months, years, even generations. An archer ecosystem nurtured by compulsory practice laws across multiple reigns. A requisitioned fleet estimated at up to 1,000 ships, along with a transparent contract-based payroll system. A march of roughly 400 kilometers over about 2.5 weeks that began with only 8 days of rations, and a terrain choke point estimated at 700 to 900 meters wide that ground down a many-fold numerical advantage. Remove any one link, the chain breaks, and there is no Agincourt. But here is the reverse angle few people mention. That resounding victory itself later became proof of the limits of logistics. England could ferry an army across the sea and win an afternoon, but it lacked the resources to permanently occupy a France many times its population. Maintaining garrisons, supplying them, and paying wages for a prolonged occupation is a problem dozens of times larger than sustaining a campaign of a few months. And by 1453, after nearly 4 decades of attrition, the English had lost almost all their land on the continent, holding on only to Calais. A tactical victory, however dazzling, cannot rescue a supply problem that has no solution. Logistics carried Henry V to glory, and logistics likewise set the ceiling on the ambitions of his entire dynasty. That lesson did not rest quietly in the 15th century, but repeated itself over the 600 years that followed. From the supply convoys of the 2 world wars to modern campaigns, where military leaders still pass down the same distilled maxim: amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. And if you look closely, that truth is not only for war. Every project you have ever worked on, every business you have ever seen succeed or fail, every exam you have ever studied for, is in essence a version of the Agincourt problem. It is not the most talented who wins, but the one who delivers the right resources to the right place at the right time. A talented team without process will lose to an ordinary team with a system, exactly as the finest knights in Europe lost to a band of starving, freezing archers organized into a unified machine. The victor at Agincourt was not the braver side. Both sides that day were unbelievably brave, but the side that had solved the problem of transport and organization years before the first arrow left the bowstring. So if you carry away only one thing from this story, let it be this: willpower keeps you from quitting. Talent lets you shine for a moment, but it is the system that delivers the right thing to the right place at the right time that decides who is still standing when that moment arrives. 6,000 exhausted men on a muddy field in 1415 proved it, and every smoothly running supply chain around us today quietly proves it again each day. Please note that the figures in this video are estimates synthesized from many different research sources and may vary depending on the historian. The only certainty is the lesson that remains: the battle was decided before it began, in the granaries, harbors, and ledgers that no epic ever bothers to celebrate. The field of Agincourt today is just a quiet stretch of farmland in northern France, with no monument large enough to tell everything that once happened there. But perhaps that is fitting, because what is most worth remembering about this battle never lay on the field. It lay in the yew forests planted decades in advance, in the indenture contracts recorded line by line, in the 8 days of dry rations counted out into every sack, in the 1,000 boats that quietly crossed the channel without a single epic ever naming them. The greatest victories are often built from the most tedious work done right, done fully, and done in advance. Whoever absorbs that will stop waiting for their own moment of genius and start building their own system, brick by small brick, long before anyone notices. Because history, in the end, does not belong to those who are most brilliant on a single morning. It belongs to those who finished preparing many winters before. An arrow flies for only a few seconds, but for that arrow to be on the bowstring in the right place, at the right time, is the silent labor of an entire generation, and that is the real story Agincourt leaves us.